Let's take a look at our white blood cells next. There are 5 different types of white blood cells that circulate in our blood. We've got the phils, which include the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And then we've also got the monocytes, which when they move into the tissues, they become macrophages. And then we've also got the lymphocytes. We have a lot fewer white blood cells than we do red blood cells, and that's because the white blood cells don't stay in the blood vessels. So a lot of the white blood cells will move out of the blood vessels and into the tissues to look for invaders. And they also will circulate throughout the lymphatic system, and they might even be hanging out in the lymph nodes looking for invaders. They do have a larger size than the red blood cells, and they do have a nucleus as well. So they do tend to live longer than the red blood cells do. And as far as their function, they're used for defense. They're part of our immune system, so they're used for protection. With the white blood cells that circulate in our blood, we can classify them either into granulocytes or agranulocytes. The granulocytes have little granules in their cytoplasm. These would be all of the phils. So our neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils would all be granulocytes. The agranulocytes, A meaning without, they do not have any granules in their cytoplasm. So these would be the cytes, the monocytes, and the lymphocytes would be your agranulocytes. So I would make sure that you know that for testing purposes. So make sure that you know which ones are granulocytes and which ones are agranulocytes. Our first granulocyte is our neutrophils. These are the most common of our white blood cells that we'll see in our blood. Their big job is that they're phagocytes. And they're also one of the first responders to get to the site of an infection. And so they just will gobble up any bacteria, dirt, dead cells, anything that they find that's foreign there, they will get rid of it and eat it, and it'll be gone. The reason they're called neutrophils is because their granules stay in kind of a neutral color. They're not red and they're not blue, they're kind of in between those colors. Our next granulocyte would be the eosinophils. You can recognize the eosinophils because they have red staining granules. So that really makes them stand out. And they are phagocytic, but that's not their main job. So they like to go after and kill parasites like worms. So what they'll do is when they find a worm, they actually will dump out their granule contents onto the worm. And the granule contents have a lot of nasty chemicals in them that will poke holes in the worm, and then that will kill the worm. And then the eosinophils are also involved in allergies as well. Basophils are our last type of granulocyte, and their granules are going to stain blue. They are not phagocytic. They can go after some parasites, but kind of their claim to fame is that their granules contain histamine, and that chemical histamine that they release is going to cause all the signs of inflammation and allergies. So basophils will be involved in inflammation and allergies because their granules contain histamine. All right, now we get to our agranulocytes. So the monocytes do not have granules in their cytoplasm. And the monocytes are going to be the largest of our white blood cells. And their job is they're phagocytes. So while they're in the blood, they're called monocytes. But as soon as they move into the tissues, they become macrophages. And the word macrophage literally means big eater. And so when they get to the site of an infection, they will just eat any of the microorganisms, dead cells, dirt, whatever they find. All right, and then our other agranulocyte would be the lymphocytes. And these lymphocytes are interesting in their shape. They have a very large nucleus. It takes up almost the entire cell, and that's how you recognize a lymphocyte. There are 3 different types of lymphocytes. We have B lymphocytes, which make antibodies. We have T lymphocytes, which have a couple different jobs, but they will go around and kill infected cells and cancer cells and also transplanted cells. And then we also have natural killer cells, which will also go after a lot of the same things that the T lymphocytes do, but they work in a little bit different way. Here are some pictures of the white blood cells that we find in our blood. I'm not going to put a picture on the exam and ask you to identify which type of white blood cell they are, but they're just nice to be able to see what they look like. So here's a neutrophil with the neutral staining granules, so they're not red and they're not blue. And remember that the neutrophil's job is their phagocytes. Here's an eosinophil with the red staining granules, and its big job is to go after parasites, so things like worms. And then here's a basophil, and its granules are going to stain blue, and its big job is to those granules contain histamine, and so that'll cause the signs of inflammation and allergies. And then here's a monocyte, and when it gets into the tissues, it becomes a macrophage, and its big job is it's a phagocyte. And then here's a lymphocyte, and it can be either a B lymphocyte, a T lymphocyte, or a natural killer cell. You can't really tell by just looking at a lymphocyte. Okay, and here's just another blood smear. So you can see that most numerous we have are these red blood cells, and we've got some little platelets here. And then here's our white blood cells, okay, a little bit bigger than the red blood cells. So we've got a neutrophil here, an eosinophil with the red staining granules, and then here's a lymphocyte that's mostly nucleus there. All right, our last type of cell that we find in the blood would be the platelets, which are involved in blood clotting. And they're also called thrombocytes, after the other name for blood clot, which is thrombus. These platelets are actually made in the red bone marrow from cells called megakaryocytes. And mega just means large, and karyo means nucleus, and cyte just means cell. So these are just large nucleus cells, and what happens is these megakaryocytes will just start shedding little pieces of themselves, and these little pieces become the platelets. And these platelets do not have a nucleus and no organelles in them, and they do contain granules which have things like epinephrine and serotonin, which will cause vasoconstriction to help stop blood loss. ADP, which will help make the platelets stick together to make a platelet plug, which we'll need to help form the blood clot. And then some other chemicals that we'll talk about later that are also needed for making a blood clot as well. And then this picture just shows the platelets, just so you can see how much smaller they are compared to the red blood cells. And then this is just a reminder that the platelets and all of the white blood cells all come from the same hematopoietic stem cells that the red blood cells do, that are living in the red bone marrow. And then with this table, all I just want you to take a look at is that in our blood, the most numerous type of cell that we have would be the red blood cells, followed by the platelets, and then the white blood cells would be the least numerous. And out of our white blood cells, the most common one we see in the blood would be the neutrophils, and the rarest would be your basophils. We don't see those very often. And then the other nice thing about this table from your book is that it gives the main function for each of these different cell types. So that would be a good thing to study.